So you're welcome. You obviously either at home or here, you don't have to say anything. None of you here, we can see, the recording can't see you. But my sincere hope is this will be discussion rather than lecture, exploration rather than anything else. So it's really good to have a good audience, both online and here. As I said, it's been an important subject that I have pondered for 20 years or more. But it was with the Queen, the late Queen's death, that I know a number of discussions popped up all over both the parish and elsewhere that brought this into real, the forefront of people's minds. What does happen just before, at, just after death? But that's not a big enough scope. What happens at the end of time? Heaven, hell, judgment. All that is part of our subject matter tonight. What's abundantly clear to me is that there are good questions and good intuitions. My colleague here may say something, and you may think, no. You're not necessarily disagreeing with him. It's just that when one person says something, there are other perspectives that need to be said. And my experience of this subject matter is that we need to bring together so many different perspectives. So it is about discussion. It's about questions, intuitions. Have we got everything that needs to be said out there? The only thing that seems abundantly clear to me is that there is no one right answer. I have to my right hand here a Bible. There are plenty of verses which say something very definite and specific. And those verses don't agree with each other. And so it's about building up an overall picture that I think is important. So this evening is about, it will involve humility and listening to each other. And if someone says something you disagree with, that doesn't mean they're wrong or you're wrong. My hope is that we will keep discussing this till about 8:30. And at around 8:30, we will rightly bring all these words into prayer. And I think Ben is going to lead us in Compline at around 8:30. And we'll probably stop the recording then. Does that sound okay to you online? I get lots of nods, that's lovely. Does that sound okay? In which case, just to set the ball rolling, I've asked Jonathan to say whatever he likes. But not everything.
Whatever I like, but not everything. Thank you, Robert, very much. I'm going to begin this evening with a poem. It's a poem that I think you will probably recognise.
Time out, you're not on.
My microphone has now stopped working.
Yeah, I forget that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to begin by reading a poem. It's a poem that will be familiar to many of you. It's one that is read at many funerals. I've heard it at family funerals of my own that I have been to. It's called Death is Nothing at All by Henry Stott Holland. Death is nothing at all. It does not count. I have only slipped away into the next room. Nothing has happened. Everything remains exactly as it was. I am I, and you are you. And the old life that we lived so fondly together is untouched, unchanged. Whatever we were to each other that we are still. Call me by the old familiar name. Speak of me in the easy way you always used. Put no difference in your tone. Wear no forced air of solemnity or sorrow. Laugh as we always laughed at the little jokes we enjoyed together. Play, smile, think of me, pray for me. Let my name be ever the household word that it always was. Let it be spoken without an effort, without the ghost of a shadow upon it. Life means all that it ever meant. It is the same that it ever was. There is absolute and unbroken continuity. What is this death but a negligible accident? Why should I be out of mind because I am out of sight? I am but waiting for you for an interval, somewhere very near, just around the corner. All is well. Nothing is hurt. Nothing is lost. One brief moment, and all will be as it was before. How we shall laugh at the trouble of parting when we meet again. That is a much-loved poem by many, many people. It was written in 1910. Henry Scott Holland was Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford University. Prior to that, he was a canon at St. Paul's. And it was in a sermon that he was preaching, trying to address two things, where he first introduced those lines. And in his sermon, what he was trying to help people with was first the fear they had, the fear that people were expressing to him of the unexplained, the many things that were unexplained, are unexplained around death and what happens thereafter. And the second thing he wanted to provide was a deep sense of reassurance that there is a continuity, something that people could really grab hold of and be sustained by. And the problem that I have with that poem personally is the first line. Death is nothing at all. I have just come from spending the afternoon with a dear friend who is nearing the end of his life in a hospice. And you only have to be in that environment to realize and to remember that to say that death is nothing at all is selling an awful lot of people very short. Death is real. There is no getting away from it, and its impact is profound. So holding that on the one hand, and then recognizing that what Henry Scott Holland is trying to do is to both address some of the unexplained around it all and to provide that sense of reassurance, well, I find myself then saying, well, if the simple formula of death is nothing at all doesn't quite work, where else then can I reach? What else am I going to reach for that is going to help me try to make sense of some of these things and to come up with an understanding that I can live with and I can hopefully share with others as we all deal with death in our lives. So I come at this from the starting point of Henry Scott Holland's words, very much loved, but if we need something else, where do we reach for that? And that's perhaps the jumping off point that I would like to use for tonight. I'm going to ask Robert to respond to, and then gradually we can broaden the conversation from there.
Thank you. My understanding of the history of the poem is that although it was picked up fairly quickly in 1910, by 1920 it was a mega hit, because following the carnage of the First War, when it felt to so many people that death was overwhelming, the amount of death was overwhelming, that is when the words "death is nothing at all" tried to reduce the threat and danger of death. And so understanding it in that context makes more sense. I too share with Jonathan a severe questioning of all that is said in it as it is heard today. That's not denying the popularity of it, because it says something profound. And so what I'm going to ask you now is, what, if you like it or loathe it, what does it say to you? What does it convey that feels godly and true? And are the words that really stick with you as though that's not right? So my point there is about context changes how we hear words. Have you used this poem? Do you know this poem? Do you like this poem? Do you hate this poem? Graham.
I think it's interesting to contrast the poem with Dylan Thomas's Rage, Rage, Rage at the Dying.
No, I think, Jane, I think I'm going to try and speak to... So, sorry, this is my way of keeping your contributions short, because I will try and summarise them to those online in case they don't hear you. Thank you, Jane. Sorry. Go on, Graham. Contrast with
Dylan Thomas's Rage, Rage at the Do Not Go Kindly,
gentle kindly into the night.
I read somewhere that death is an obscenity, somebody said. And so I think I agree with the statement that to say it's nothing at all, it's a kind thing to say to people, but I don't believe that's how a lot of people feel when a loved one passes away.
I'll just check with people online. Did you hear any or some of that? You heard, yes, you heard most of that. So that's a beautiful way of putting it. If I can summarise that, Graham, contrast Scott Holland with Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gently into the Night, yes, which is about rage and frustration and anger and clinging on to the preciousness of life. Mary.
I feel, having lost my husband so recently, that it speaks to me in a way what I'm experiencing, which is having had a life very blessed. I still feel 55 years of blessing, and after he'd gone, fortunately he was at home when he died, he hasn't totally gone, if you see what I mean. And so I find huge comfort from that, although mentally years bereft. And so I feel it speaks to me quite a lot, actually. Except I agree with you, the nothing at all I find that quite reassuring, if you're going to be able to reassure us in that way later on.
So I think I would say, so if I can maybe just summarise for those on screen, Trevor died a few months ago, and after 55 years of contentment and joy together, that sense of continuity is very precious. He hasn't gone from you. And that is a truth, I believe, that needs to be affirmed. And in as much as Scott Holland's poem is affirming that, that is right. If there are other examples, they don't deny the power of what you've just said, Mary. So I'm glad it's said. And therefore, I would just say, having led a funeral for someone who has been killed in a road traffic accident at age 25, I would no way use this poem, but nor am I denying the power of what you've said. So again, context.
I would absolutely echo what Robert has just said about both context and the importance of that sense of continuity. And the thing about that, I want to then bring back to what Graham was just saying about hearing death described as an obscenity. because I think there's a real challenge here for us, and I think it's something we really need to take seriously, the idea that if we think of death as an obscenity, we are setting ourselves up for quite a difficult time, for two reasons. One, because of its inevitability, and therefore if we are positioning ourselves with the idea that we are facing an ultimate obscenity in our life, how do we then approach that as we grow older? And the second thing is back to this point about continuity, because I do feel very strongly that one of the most important things we can do, particularly in the funeral service, for example, one of the most powerful things for me that speaks in the funeral service is when we stand before the coffin and the priest says, we commend this person into God's care in sure and certain hope of the resurrection. And there is something about wanting to counter the idea of obscenity with a sure and certain hope in a continuity, which I believe is very, very important. It certainly sustains me, and I think I would want to really find all the means we can to encourage others to see that sense of continuity being expressed in that way. I think that's very important. There was another hat. Yes.
And following on from what you said, in sure and certain hope in the resurrection are powerful and good words. The poem itself, although I think it says a lot, possibly its constant popularity, to my mind, can make it slightly trite and hackneyed.
Okay.
It's not, in sure and certain hope is much more powerful, to my mind. 6 or 7 words.
So here we have Anthony saying that sure and certain hope gives us, in a small package, a very powerful set of words. The danger, and we see that with words of any sort, words that they can be words of liturgy, words of poetry, things that get repeated a lot, is that they sort of lose some of their impact, lose some of their meaning because it becomes diluted over time. Maybe it's good to then be able to hold on to those very small, more powerful phrases that can help us. Robert.
As Jonathan read the Scott Holland poem, I don't think I had heard so clearly before a phrase that came right towards the end. Did you hear the poem said, all is well? And as I heard that, I couldn't but hear the words from Julian of Norwich, which you will know well, which is all shall be well. All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And as you read it, Jonathan, I thought, wow, what a difference. Scott Holland is saying, all is well now. I'm looking at you, Anthony, don't worry. Whereas actually, if we're starting to talk about resurrection and hope, and I'm naturally pushing that further away, there is something about, as I see it, the Christian approach to life and to death, that some things are not good now, but in the end, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That only works not in the here and now, not in our lifetime, because that, Graham, as I understand it, is where Dylan Thomas was, which it is he was so angry at his father about to die. He wanted everything to be well now in life. Whereas Julian Norwich is saying not just in lifetime, but more just after death. But actually, do we trust in a God that at the end of time, all shall be well? So there's quite a difference between all is well, in my mind, and all shall be well.
But it's not saying exactly the same thing as Peter talk. But he's speaking from eternity, as it were. And therefore you're getting a different perspective from the perspective that we have. I mean, I find the I am and you are you the most
it's still in the present, as it were, but the eternal present. And he's speaking.
And minimize it.
It's also in the present, but in a time and space oriented present.
Did you get that? Part of what, if I understand that right, part of what rightly that was being commented on is that the Scott Holland poem is written, as it were, from the other side of death, looking back to us. And one of the things that I think, if people are ready, we might move on to, is this difficulty of perspective of where we're speaking from. Already noticing that the Dylan Thomas is speaking in the face of imminent death, and I was speaking the Julian of Norwich, as one living, knowing that the vindication of God will come at the end of time. But the right is written, as it were, at the other end.
Could I just ask, if you're online, could you just make sure you stay muted unless you're asking a question, because I'm just conscious we're getting quite a bit of interference on there, so do please just press your mute button, that'd be lovely, thank you.
People in church are being quite muted. Looking at no one in particular, unusually muted.
I think picking up the comment of the gentleman here, we need to be clear which voice is speaking. Is this addressed to the person who's dying, or is it intended to describe or assuage the feelings of those who remain? If I look back on the death of my father and mother, I still feel a pain that I didn't talk to them more, and say more to them. And it occurred many years ago. So I think exactly who we need to be clear which person we're talking about, the person who went or the person who remained.
No.
And perhaps related whether we're thinking about our own death or the death of someone else.
Correct.
I think there is for me, a certain comfort in the poem about the death of somebody else, that sense that they are just in the next world. That could be quite pleasing, couldn't it? What that means for our own consciousness or lack of it, when we move on, is somewhat more forward.
Jane?
Can I possibly move completely away from this poem and just talk about death itself? Because I think the first time I was in the presence of someone who died, it was my dad. And he was in hospital here in Guildford. And we went to see him, and it was so obvious that he wasn't there. There was his body, but it was quite a peaceful thing in a way, because he wasn't there. So that sort of begs the question, what?
Can I just again, checking that people at home, I'm really trying to summarise, Jane, the power of what you've just said. When your father died, there was, because you were there as it were, in the room, there was a very clear sense that he was no longer there. So, as part of, I don't want to keep on going back to the Scott Holland poem, but it says there is absolute and unbroken continuity. Actually, what's wrong with saying, after, if I may, to you, Mary, after a life well lived, however much Trevor is present to you, actually he is not, your father, was no longer present. And there is something, I think, both real, honest, true about just what you've said, Jane. And if that is not named, we're missing out. That death finishes. And I was certainly brought up with this idea that death is one of the things that gives life meaning, because we are limited in not believing in reincarnation. And don't worry, Adrian, give it a go this time. If you live a rotten life this time, don't worry, you'll come back as a slug. Why did I pick on you, Adrian? Adrian will come back as a slug and try and do better. No, there is something so, I can't express it more than so fundamentally Christian about saying we have one life, hallelujah, and therefore it becomes very precious. Now that is a difficult thing to say because of all sorts of people who die early or die in pain or whatever, but actually it is acknowledging the preciousness of life because it is limited in some ways.
I guess I'd say, sort of in response to that, the flip side of that, there was also a kind of theology of death. You get in a lot of churches, and particularly this very sharp divide between heaven and hell, and death is your one, that's the closing of your opportunity to go down one path rather than the other. I feel if we buy into that, that really does negate a lot of what people said about the possibility of finding comfort in death, because it becomes this terrifying thing. The room next door can be an eternal torture chamber. So I guess that's where I disagree personally. I find the strongest disagreement with many other Christians is on this question how it wrong, it has the potential to become this source of immense kind of inadvertent cruelty.
Thank you, Mark. And just for those at home, so Mark was saying that in some ways the sort of the counter, or something that sort of sits slightly against what we were just saying about the finality of death and the break, is that with a lot of the language that is used around heaven and hell, we can then end up setting up a very difficult duality, a very difficult situation where we suddenly say, well, our loved one who has died could have gone one way or the other, and that is the end, and there is no going back on that position. And that's where I think we need to look a little bit at some of our thinking around what happens when we die and where is God in that process. One of the things I have always been struck with in the situations when I've been sitting with those who are close to death, or indeed the few situations when I've been in the room with someone who has died, I absolutely would agree with Jane's comment about the person is no longer there, and yet there is a very strong sense of, for me, the presence of God in the room. I do not feel that I sit in that room alone with the empty shell of a human being. That has never been my experience. What we then need to think about is, and this was something that came up in one of the discussions that sparked some of tonight, was people reflecting on the death of the Queen. They were saying that the thousands of people who walked past the coffin on the catafalque, where was the Queen? And into this, I want to throw a line which, for me, is one of the most important lines in the entire Gospel. It is when Jesus speaks to the repentant thief on the cross, who is speaking to Jesus and saying, we have got what we deserve. This man did not get what he deserved. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus' reply is, today you will be with me in paradise. Today you will be with me in paradise. And I think that's a really important phrase for a number of reasons. The first thing is that it says today. It doesn't say after a period of time which is indeterminate and depends on a whole variety of things. It doesn't say at the end of time, after countless millennia of lying in darkness and we don't know what's going to happen, it says, today you will be with me in paradise. And so this is a point where, for me, we have the discontinuity of the earthly life that has finished, but we also have a continuity into the what next. Now, at the risk of opening it up too far in one hit, but I'll do that anyway, and then you can pick up the pieces, Robert, in a minute. I want to then pick up, Mark, on what you said about heaven and hell. We are very often used to thinking, and indeed, Mark, you used an image, a very graphic image, when you said we can think of hell as the sort of eternal torture chamber, which is a horrific image, and one which I don't get. It really puts things in very stark terms. I once read a very helpful definition of hell that said that hell was a place where we reject the loving kindness of God, the invitation of God, the constant, never-ending invitation of God to come to God in penitence, in humility, to seek the love. Think of the prodigal son, for example. Hell is the place where the prodigal son simply goes, I'm not going back. Why should I go back? I'm not going back. So I will sit here in the dark and the cold rather than go back. That, to me, makes an awful lot of sense of the constant presence of the loving God who, throughout our lives, and indeed beyond, seeks the relationship with us that will bring us back into the fold of that love. And I believe that never, ever goes away. And I believe that's the starting point of what Jesus is saying in, today you will be with me in paradise. Today you will enter the next stage, whatever that may be. And we may, if we have time, we'll come on to some of the thinking around paradise as well. But that for me is really important. And I want to set that alongside the very stark heaven and hell sort of description that we just heard. Robert.
At which point I ran out of fingers to try and remember all the various things that Jonathan said that I want to pick up on. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to lay alongside, today you will be with me in paradise, with another phrase that is probably very familiar to many of us. Rest in peace and rise in glory. And rather than immediately pick up on Jonathan's points, of which there were many, I'm wondering which of those two phrases, or which bits of those phrases, resonate with you, which can include saying, actually, you love both phrases, but note, they are somewhat different. Today, you will be with me in paradise, but the first part of the other saying, rest in peace, has always had the connotation of resting for an unspecified time, as it were, a godly time, not one of our lifetimes, and in the end, rise in glory. So there's quite a sort of mix of tenses and expectations there. Perfectly possible to say, I love both phrases, and they meet, but it may be that one is more revealing, more expressive to you than the other. So that's other things I want to pick up on what you said, but rest in peace, rise in glory. Andy, give us a word.
In the rather Protestant tradition I grew up in, that phrase was not used. It's one I've encountered in faith life, and I can't treasure it. Both cases, because it seems to me to pick up two very strong strands of what the New Testament says to us about what lies beyond death. It is both about our security and our resting in the presence of God, and it is also about participation in new heaven, new earth, the new Jerusalem, all the language which is about recreation and renewal. I love using because it both speaks to the rest, which many people long, I think, as they reach the end of their life, and also that sense of recreation, renewal, and wholeness of life.
Yes, Adrian?
I was just thinking, I mean, there's a number of strands to this in the sense that we're going so wide that almost any view is valid, isn't it? And what I took out of Jonathan's room, I've never heard before, is Jesus saying, "Today you will be with me, Wolston or heaven or wherever. It doesn't matter where I am," and that was what I was getting out of what Jonathan was saying. There's the other strand, which is so much of what we indulge in the dying process, in being with people who are dying, and the funerals particularly, is that we are seeking to reassure ourselves what we believe and bring comfort to ourselves and to hope, not to use that word in a sort of too aspirational way, that it's reaffirming that we are right in what we believe. Which is why I always take from the point of view of what Jonathan was saying, is the only thing you rest on is that you're with me, Jesus, because it's very difficult to try and visualize any other concept of how that works. You know, whether you're sort of looking at pot plants in heaven because you like that, or what is your idea of heaven? And there again, what is it like being with me for eternity? That again can be quite a frightening thought. And so I do think that we have to try and divide into sort of three strands of thought. One is the idea of what's it been to us when somebody has gone, so that we get the comfort out of that. What is the afterlife? Who knows? And is the process of dying, which is the third thing we haven't mentioned, which frightens a lot of people, and they try and separate dying from death. So I think there's a number of things we need to sort of kind of think about. But I come from the point of view that it's with me, and that kind of focuses it down as to how that might work.
Thank you, Adrian, because as you were saying that, I've never heard "today you will be with me in paradise" in the way that you've just elaborated it. Hear it again: "Today you will be with me in Warpleston." Doesn't have quite the same resonance, but actually, at the beginning of funeral service, I process in here, and there are some, in the prayer book, there are some sentences that are specified to be said, biblical sentences, and the one I love saying more than anything other is, "Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ our Lord." Not Warpleston, not Woking, not death, not nothing, whatever. So I'd never heard that, the phrase that Jonathan quoted there about "today you will be with me." Just stop it there. Yeah. So did you say anything goes? I'm absolutely not a believer that anything goes. As we talk about life and death, I am a believer that it is so rich and multifaceted that we need different phrases.
I think it is a case of I believe, but what?
Yeah.
Your view of what you believe is as valid as anybody else's.
Because if I may, Mary, coming back to you, I think of Trevor and resting in peace. He lived a good life, I would like to think. And one of my favourite prayers in the funeral service, "Support us, O Lord, all the day long of this troublous life." A beautiful prayer, because it acknowledges that when you're 80, 85, you've had quite a lot of difficult times, and it's saying, "And now be at peace." I cannot use that prayer for the death of a 6-month-old. I do not say to a 6-month-old, "Rest in peace." I may want to convey to the parents, "I hope you will find peace," but I would want to say something along the lines of, the child, however short-lived, is precious, not just was precious, but is precious. And that's the bit about it is not true that anything goes. It is true that our lives, our contexts are so different. We need to have a rich repertoire to speak the truth into a number of different contexts. I was going into hell, but where do
Okay.
you want to go?
I'll tell you what, why don't you go into hell for a moment, and then let's return to eternity, if that's...
Okay, should we do hell first, and then eternity? And Jonathan doesn't realise that that may be actually very important. So I'm not going to be able to pick up exactly all you said, but without giving a full lecture, the idea of what hell is / was has changed over the centuries many, many times. And the way, it's Mark, isn't it? Mark, the way you described it is actually quite a late development. In the very early centuries of the Christian church, they had a much stronger idea that hell was a phase to go through. Because one of the things where the Christian story bumped up against culture in Greco-Roman times around the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, one of the ways it really bumped up against it was that the Christian church had a very, very strong belief that every one of us matters. Whereas if you read the Roman and the Greek epics, Achilles goes to, they wouldn't call it heaven, Hector, Odysseus, they go up there, and plebs like you and me, in the end, don't really matter. And one of the things that the Christian church preached right from the beginning, that it took centuries for the Mediterranean culture to get its mind round, was that you, everyone matters to God. And I can't finish that without saying, and will in the end get to heaven. It was only later that the development came that some people were so bad that they may, when they get to the crossroads, turn left, go to hell and never get there. Because in the earlier days, everyone, that was the obscene thing that the Christian church pronounced, was that everyone, however poor, because the church started basically at the lower levels of society, however small, however long they lived, the child that lived 2 days and then died, that one is going to heaven. That is quite different from what developed 1400 years later, which you and I have inherited, was, can I live so badly that when I get to the crossroads, I'm going down there rather than up there? The really radical message was that everything that God created, God loves, and is going that way. And they managed to tell that story in a way that didn't diminish, didn't allow someone to say, well, if I'm going to heaven, I can live a bad life now. That comes later. That comes later in history. So what you quote, I think, were some good things to ponder. Can we live such a bad life that we never get to heaven? And part of what I'm trying to draw on there is actually there is a strong tradition that was validated for many centuries that said, before you ask that question, just remember, everything God creates is going to be redeemed. I'm making a new heaven and a new earth. It was not, oh, by the way, you're in the heaven, I'll recreate a new earth, but sorry, you guys are downstairs. It was the staggering concept that actually every single person and the whole of creation, not every person, but the whole of creation was going to be renewed. 1,000 years later, the church started to develop very different pictures about heaven and hell and judgment that I think have caused us trouble ever since. And by now, I'm afraid I've forgotten what you said, but I got that off my chest, so I'm feeling better for that. Speak up then, sorry.
There is something really important in Mark's book, which is about the spring of Christians, and particularly on a day when the news confirms what we probably already knew, which is that for the first time ever less than half the country is Christian. baptism was told by a fellow so-called Christian that it must be very difficult to now accept that his Jewish and atheist parents are going to hell. I think we do have to own the fact that one of the reasons we societally struggle with death is that a lot of profoundly uncomfortable things have been said about what Christian death and resurrection might look like. And we've probably done a lot of damage along the way.
Steve.
I like what you said. It's very comforting. I think I rather feel I want to be back in the first few centuries of Christianity. But it was only on last Sunday when the reading was that one will be in the field and one will be temporal. One will be living the field and another will be temporal. I case particularly, I think, in Matthew, that there was this black and white discussion of heaven and hell. And I know you and Mohan says that there is a tradition of black and white speaking in Judaism, but it leaves me uncomfortable to think of how to reconcile. How to reconcile what I might want to do with what I was given as scripture. This is the word of the Lord.
Absolutely. And if you preach to or promote too clearly from the start a message of, putting it bluntly, everyone goes to heaven, you can actually diminish a sense of moral responsibility. And actually what, if I can pick on you, what you do tomorrow, the choices you make tomorrow matter. If we just say, don't worry, we're all, so if you focus too much on the end of time, it actually undermines not just our sense of moral responsibility, but our humanity. I believe that the choices I make tomorrow matter, and matter potentially profoundly, depending on the nature of those choices. So there's something really important about, there are black and white decisions in life. One of the things that developed over the centuries was wanting to honour the passage, Stephen, you just quoted, which, did you hear it home? That passage about, it comes in Matthew 54? 24. I was going to say, my copy of Matthew only has 28 chapters. Matthew 54, look it up when you get home, write it. Matthew 24. There are two people working in the field, and one will be taken and one will not. Yeah. The church pondered this. That being taken is easy. It's not dissimilar to today you will be with me in paradise. What happens to the one that's not? And to some extent, I'm back to what I said to Mark, which is actually what developed over time was that when we die, we may not yet be ready for heaven. And the not being taken was then not a permanent choice, which is what happened by the Middle Ages. If at the moment of death, you're not in a state of grace, you're on the fast escalator downstairs. That is a very later developed phase. Two people working in the field, one will be taken and one will not, implies there is a difference, but that person is not yet ready. You may not like this, but that's part of the thing that led eventually towards the idea of purgatory, which is on death, we may not be ready for paradise. So I'm not fudging it, because I think this is part of it. You quote me back a text. We need to take the heart of the text seriously. There's a difference between black and white. The choices you make tomorrow matter. But it doesn't mean some of the things that later theology sort of put upon it. You may want to come back to me soon, but Rod first.
I was just going to say another passage that says much the same thing is the parable that's often called Dives and Lazarus, a gulf between here and there, and you cannot cross one way or the other. And I think that's probably comes from the same sort of tradition, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Between them and us, a great gulf is fixed. Yeah, but what's the gulf? And in this life or later or whatever. And this is where, see, you're right, we're back to the sort of Hebraic language which love contrasts.
I would just like to throw into the pot on that question that we're debating here is one that has exercised the church since time immemorial, and were you to read, I commend to you St. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, where he grapples with this question of, because he's being asked a very specific question, you've said all these great things about resurrection, what about all the people who've died already? And he then has to do some deep thinking and comes up with a fantastic image of how they will be raised and they will meet those who have already risen to heaven in the middle of the air, and there will be this amazing coming together of the past and the future. And he's absolutely trying to work out his theology of how does this work. And I find it very encouraging to read something like that and think, yes, this has exercised people forever. Can I come to the point about eternity? Because there's something quite important I want to say on that.
I don't know if Jonathan saw that I was saying we've got 5 minutes, so Jonathan can do eternity in 5 minutes.
I can do eternity in 5 minutes, Robert, as long as I have a big biro in my hand. I have, throughout my life, had a lot of problems with eternity and the concept of eternity and grappled with it, and I studied with somebody who had similar problems, and we would sort of talk about the way that you're almost physiologically, your brain can go strange if you try and spend too much time thinking about it. And I was talking with a very wise spiritual director some years ago who gave me a really very helpful image for this. And I want to come at this from two directions. We'll come back to the big biro in a moment because we will need it. But the first thing to say is it links slightly with thoughts on paradise, and I completely get, Adrian, your point about, we have to be very careful about the language of anything goes. From a pastoral perspective, I am always very keen to explore with people what is your idea of heaven, by which I mean not give me some extraordinary sort of image of something that's deep and theological, and what is your idea of heaven? And to which somebody will reply, a summer's evening where I'm sitting out in the garden and the blackbirds are singing and the sun is going down, and that is heaven. Or as somebody very, very memorably said to me when we were having a conversation on the run-up to their death, they said, my idea of heaven is a glass of pink gin sitting in my favourite armchair. That, for me, is heaven. And I think there's something very important about those images and working with those images for ourselves, because God knows us in our deepest selves, and God knows the things that we take particular delight in. And whatever those may be, can give us a little gateway into, what heaven may feel like. And this is an emotional thing. It is about how heaven may feel. Now, once you then think about sitting in the garden on that summer's evening, or sitting in your favourite armchair with the gin and tonic, or sitting with a loved one on the sofa, that sense that time stands still is something that I think we can all relate to. Suddenly we look at the watch and the time has moved on by an hour and we didn't notice. Which brings us to eternity. The thing about eternity is we have our span of life, and this is where the biro comes in, which is a defined length. And we're used to measuring time along this line. And when we then think about eternity, we simply think, well, golly, this line therefore goes on sort of through the wall of St. Mary's and out into the high street and down there. That's an incredibly long time. How am I ever going to cope with that? And my very wise spiritual director said to me, well, once we die, this line makes no more sense. This is the line by which we measured our earthly life. Once you are off that line, there is no measurement. And I then want to link that back to the summer's evening sitting in the garden, the time sitting on the sofa with the loved one, the time sitting on. And that is the beginning of trying to understand, for me, how eternity works. It is not something that is designed to torment us. People have made plenty of jokes about, you know, sitting on a cloud playing the harp forever and ever and ever, and how's that going to work? It's the loving God is never going to allow us to be in a state of perpetual torment because of the measurement of how eternity works. And for me, that is a very helpful way into starting to think about the whole thing. And I offer that to you with the aid of the Vic Biro.
I have no biro in my hand, but may I tell you that the Regius Professor of Theology at Oxford was travelling down to London on a train one day, when this is about 30 years ago, when an enthusiastic student schooled in the Billy Graham School of Theology accosted him. He was not wearing a dog collar, and said, "Have you been saved?" Now, I can't do this in Greek, but in Greek, the professor muttered under his voice, if you'll allow me to do it in English, "Have been saved, am being saved, will be saved." Because Paul, in his letters, uses all three verbs. If I may look at you, Andy. Has Andy Wheeler been saved? Yes. Because nothing to do with Andy, but because what Jesus did on the cross. Is Andy being saved? That's why your decisions matter today, tomorrow, and on. Will Andy be saved? There is such a strong theme in all Paul's writing that Andy will only be saved when we are all saved. New heaven and new earth. Behold, I am doing a new thing, a new creation. And that sense of salvation, redemption, whatever you call it, is not yours alone. It's only something that God does to everything God loves. And it's that phrase that is not dissimilar to what Jonathan was just saying there about holding together different perspectives. I have been saved. I am being saved. I will be saved. I have been loved. I am being loved. I will be loved.
Can I have one more? I just want to use one more minute to pick up on the third thing which Adrian said, which I don't want us to go home tonight without having pondered for a moment, which was, Adrian, you said something about the process of dying. And in a way, what I want to do is just to bring everything we've been talking about back into our lives here tonight, because we are all here full of life, sentient beings who have N years of life left before us. So how does any of this change or affect the way in which we live our lives now? My experience tells me that there is nothing neat and tidy about the process of dying. Sometimes people like to use the language of dying well, and I'm not entirely sure I know what that means, but I think the number of us who have ever experienced the death of a loved one that has been beatific and calm and peaceful and beautiful and wonderful, over against those that have taken place surrounded by medical interventions and wires and monitors and stuff, and suddenly life is no more, we have to think about a phrase like dying well very carefully. And I want to offer you something that came to me as I was walking just the other week in Surrey Research Park, lunchtime. I'm out on an autumnal day, and I was crunching through the acorns on the ground. And I suddenly had a moment of realizing that new life is not all about the springtime. New life actually takes its formation in the autumn. and that it is in the autumn we see all of the signs of the possibility of the new life being prepared. And so perhaps a way into this idea of the process of dying is that we start to live with the idea, a little as we have been doing tonight, and we take comfort that as we live the rest of our lives, God walks with us, the God who has prepared for us so many of the things we have been talking about tonight. And this is the time when we, with God, can be working on the formation of that next stage as we enter the autumn of our lives, however you want to define that. And I think for me that is something which I certainly want to take with me into my remaining days, and you will probably hear me speak about it in different ways at different times. But I'd like to just commend that to you. There were plenty of authors who have tackled this. Richard Raw, for example, has written about this in looking at the second half of life and so on. But perhaps something there to work with as we live the rest of our lives.